Not every weight has the fate we imagine. The sun rose slowly over the dry expanse of Arizona territory, painting golden the barren lands that stretched as far as the eye could see. Thomas Mitchell woke up before the first lightning bolt touched his window, as he had done every day for 15 years. At 42, his calloused hands knew every inch of his property, every fence that needed repair, every animal that depended on his care. But on that September morning, there was something different in the air, an expectation that made his heart beat faster than usual. For 6 months, Thomas exchanged letters with Margaret Sullivan, a 25-year-old girl living in Chicago. Her words came like fresh water in the desert of her loneliness. Margaret wrote about her simple dreams, to have a family, to grow a garden, to find peace away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. Thomas responded by telling about his land, his horses, about how the sunset painted the distant mountains red and orange. Slowly, line after line, something was born between them that neither of them expected to find through paper and ink. Thomas's farm was modest but prosperous. 200 head of cattle grazed on his land, and he had built with his own hands a house of solid wood, painted white, with a porch that looked west. During the last few weeks, he prepared everything for Margaret's arrival. He bought new fabrics for the curtains, polished the furniture until it glistened, and even planted some flowers near the entrance of the house, something he had never done in his entire single life. The train would arrive at 2 in the afternoon. Thomas checked his pocket watch for the 10th time that morning. It was still only 8 o'clock. He decided to take the time to take one last look at the house, making sure everything was perfect. Margaret would travel for 5 full days to get there, leaving behind everything she knew. The least thing he could do was welcome her in the best possible way. As Thomas walked through the rooms, he thought about the letters he carefully kept in a wooden box on his desk. Margaret wrote in delicate handwriting about small details of her life, how she helped her mother with sewing, how she loved to read by candlelight when the house was silent, how she dreamed of having children who could run free under the open sky. Each letter brought their hearts closer together, building a bridge of trust and affection that seemed impossible between two strangers. The dry desert wind swept the dust across the property, making the pinwheels spin lazily. Thomas cared for the animals more carefully than usual, as if Margaret could see him through the eyes of the cattle. He wanted her to realize that he was a hard-working, reliable man, someone who built something solid in that barren land where few could prosper. At noon, Thomas took a shower and put on his best clothes, a clean white shirt, brown waistcoat, and his leather boots that he had shined to shiny. She looked in the small mirror in her room and saw a man whom time had carefully shaped, a few lines around his eyes, the result of years of watching the distant horizon, and brown hair beginning to show grey threads at his temples. He was no longer young, but his eyes still shone with the hope of someone who believed that the best days were yet to come. The wagon swayed gently as Thomas made its way down the dusty road toward the town's train station. With each meter traveled, his heart beat faster. Soon he would meet in person the woman whose words had filled his loneliness all those months. He would soon know if what they had built through letters could flourish under the relentless Arizona sun. 2 o'clock approached, and with it, the arrival of the train that would bring Margaret, or at least that's what Thomas imagined. The train whistle echoed through the small town of Willow Creek like a lonely scream in the desert. Thomas waited on the wooden platform, hat in hand, watching the clouds of steam escaping from the black locomotive. His eyes eagerly scanned every window, searching for the face he knew only from a faded photograph. The first person to get off was a fat merchant Thomas recognized from the nearby town. Then an elderly couple walking slowly, leaning on each other. Then 3 young women got off together, carrying modest luggage and looking around curiously. Thomas watched them for a moment, thinking they might be passing travelers, until one of them approached with hesitant steps. Mary Sullivan had the same face shape as Margaret in the photograph, but there was something different about her eyes. She held a letter with trembling hands as she approached. Behind her, 2 other identical young women waited in silence, like mirrors reflecting the same image 3 times. Thomas felt a strange confusion take over his thoughts, as if the world had changed shape while he was not paying attention. Mary held out the letter to Thomas, and he immediately recognized the delicate handwriting he had grown to love all those months. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the paper yellowed by the trip. Margaret's words seemed to leap off the page like burning embers. She had fallen seriously ill 2 weeks before the trip. Doctors didn't know when she would recover, or even if she would make it. Not wanting to keep Thomas waiting indefinitely, she had asked her 3 triplet sisters to travel in her place. The request was simple and desperate at the same time, that Thomas meet Mary, Rose, and Catherine, and choose one of them to marry. They were all hard-working, honest, and would be willing to build a life in Arizona. Margaret ended the letter by saying that if Thomas found happiness with one of his sisters, she would be at peace, knowing that she had not destroyed his dreams because of his weakness. Thomas folded the letter slowly, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at the 3 young women who were waiting for his reaction, each of them bearing a striking resemblance to the woman he had fallen in love with through written words. Mary, the eldest by a few minutes, had blue eyes that resembled the noonday sky. Rose smiled gently, her calloused hands showing that she wasn't afraid of hard work. Catherine, the quietest of the 3, watched everything with a quiet intelligence that reminded her of Margaret's deepest letters. The trip back to the farm was made in silence. Thomas steered the cart, while the 3 sisters sat in the back, whispering to each other occasionally. The sound of the wheels on the dry land seemed louder than ever, filling the air with a rhythm that didn't match the confusion in his mind. He had prepared to receive 1 woman, not 3. He had prepared to meet Margaret, not her replacements. When they arrived at the farm, the sisters looked around with silent approval. The White House shone in the afternoon sun. The flowers Thomas had planted swayed in the dry breeze, and the cattle grazed quietly in the distant fields. It was just as Margaret had described in her letters, a place where a woman could build a family and find peace. Thomas showed each of them the room he had prepared for Margaret. Mary touched the new curtains with careful fingers. Rose opened the window and took a deep breath of the field air. Catherine picked up one of Margaret's letters on the desk and read it silently. Her eyes filling with tears she tried to hide. Over dinner, Thomas watched the 3 sisters as they talked quietly about the trip, about Chicago, about the dreams each carried. They were different from Margaret, he realized now. Mary was more practical, talking about the best ways to organize a home. Rose had a gentle humor that lit up her eyes when she smiled. Catherine was the thinker, asking questions about the land, about the challenges of living so far from civilization. But the more he watched them, the more Thomas felt that something was wrong. It wasn't their fault. They were good, hard-working women who deserved men who would love them completely. The problem was that his heart still belonged to someone who was hundreds of miles away, battling a disease that could take her forever. That night, Thomas lay awake on the porch, staring at the stars that shone like diamonds scattered over black velvet. Somewhere in Chicago, Margaret could also be looking up at the same sky if she was strong enough to get out of bed. The distance between them had never seemed so great or so impossible to cross. The next few days passed like a strange dance where everyone knew the steps, but no one knew when the song would end. Thomas had woken up before dawn, as he always did, but now he found the house filled with female voices, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the soft sound of rustling skirts in the hallways. The 3 Sullivan sisters had brought life to their quiet home, but also a mess he had never experienced. Mary naturally took charge of the kitchen, preparing meals that reminded Thomas of his own mother, who had been dead for so many years. She woke up early to milk the only dairy cow, hummed quietly as she prepared breakfast, and always had fresh bread waiting when he returned from the fields. His hands were dexterous and efficient, transforming simple ingredients into meals that warmed both the body and the heart. When she smiled at him on the breakfast table, Thomas saw a lifetime of mornings just like that, orderly and predictable like the seasons. Rose spent her afternoons in the garden that Thomas had started, but which she had turned into something completely different. With seeds she had brought from Chicago, she planted vegetables that Thomas didn't even know could grow in that dry land. Her hands seemed to have a special gift for making things grow, and she talked to plants as if they were old friends. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch with an embroidery, her fingers creating delicate flowers on white fabric as she told stories about Chicago, about the people she had met, about the dreams she had left behind without hesitation. Catherine was the most reserved of the 3, but also the one who intrigued Thomas the most. She would spend long hours reading the few books he owned, asking questions about raising cattle, about the challenges of keeping a farm running during the harsh winters. Her questions were intelligent and practical, showing that she thought about the future, the problems that could arise, the solutions they would need to find. When she looked at him with those pensive blue eyes, Thomas felt as if she could see through his confusion to the fears he was trying to hide. With each passing day, Thomas felt the weight of the choice he had to make. The three sisters never mentioned the subject directly, but he could tell in the looks they exchanged with each other, in the silences that followed when he entered a room, in the way each tried to show their best qualities without seeming desperate. They were like three different flowers in the same garden, each beautiful in its own way, each offering something unique and valuable. But the more time he spent with them, the more Thomas felt he was betraying both himself and them. During the lonely nights on the porch, he reread Margaret's letters, looking in her words for an answer to the dilemma he faced. Margaret wrote about hope, about shared dreams, about the belief that two people could build something beautiful, even in the most arid land. How could I choose a replacement for something so specific and unique? In the second week of living together, Thomas realized that each sister had found a way to deal with the strange situation they were in. Mary cooked with even more dedication, as if she could win his heart through her stomach. Rose spent more time decorating the house, bringing color and life to corners that had lain empty for years. Catherine began to accompany him on the farm, learning about caring for the cattle, about maintaining the fences, about the hundreds of details that made the difference between success and failure in that challenging land. One particularly hot afternoon, while Thomas was repairing a damaged fence, Catherine approached carrying a jug of cold water. She remained silent for a few minutes, watching him work, before speaking for the first time about the subject that everyone avoided. Thomas stopped work and looked at her, seeing in the young woman's eyes a wisdom that didn't seem to match her age. Catherine continued speaking, her voice soft but firm, explaining that she and her sisters knew that this situation was difficult for everyone. They had come not to compete with each other, but to offer him an alternative to loneliness, a chance to build the family he wanted, even if it wasn't exactly the way he had imagined. But as Catherine spoke, Thomas realized that her words only confirmed what his heart already knew. He didn't want an alternative to Margaret. He wanted Margaret. The Sullivan sisters were extraordinary women, each capable of making a man happy, but they were not the woman whose letters had touched his soul, whose dreams had become intertwined with his own through months of careful correspondence. That night, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his life. He wrote 3 letters, one to each of the sisters, explaining his gratitude for their courage in traveling so far, for the care with which they had cared for their home, for the patience they had shown during those difficult weeks. He offered enough money for the trip back to Chicago and promised to help them find good husbands in the area if they wished to stay in Arizona. But the 4th letter was the most important. Thomas wrote to Margaret, pouring out on paper all the feelings he had kept during those weeks of uncertainty. He said he didn't want to choose between his sisters because his heart had already made its choice months ago when he received the first letter from her. He said he was willing to travel to Chicago to care for her during her recovery, to wait as long as it took for her to get strong again. It was a risky decision. Margaret might never fully recover. She could see him as a fool for rejecting 3 healthy women for a sick one, but Thomas knew he would rather face uncertainty with the woman he loved than live a safe but empty life with someone he saw only as a surrogate. The night desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of change. Thomas sealed the letters and placed them on the kitchen table, knowing that in the morning his life would take a completely different turn. I had learned that the heart has its own laws, which cannot be broken by even the most sensible logic or the most practical circumstances. The morning brought a clarity that Thomas hadn't felt in weeks. Finding the letters on the kitchen table, the 3 sisters silently read their parting words. There were no tears or protests, just a quiet understanding that seemed to run in the blood of the Sullivan women. Mary was the first to speak, her voice as calm as ever. She said she had realized from day one that his heart was not there with them. Rose smiled with that sweetness that lit up her eyes, saying that Margaret was a lucky woman to have won such a true love. Catherine just nodded, as if that decision confirmed something she already knew about Thomas's character. In 3 days, Thomas organized everything for the trip. He left the farm in the care of his nearest neighbor, a trusted man who would care for the cattle until his return. The Sullivan sisters decided to return to Chicago on the same train that would take Thomas. They had received a letter from the family saying that Margaret needed constant care, and they wanted to be close to her during her recovery. The train journey lasted 5 long days. Thomas watched the landscape gradually change. The dry desert gave way to green plains, then larger cities, until finally they reached the noisy suburbs of Chicago. The air was different here, humid, full of smoke and the aroma of thousands of people living close to each other. The Sullivan family's home was small but cozy, situated on a quiet street where children played on the sidewalk. Thomas felt his heart racing as Mary guided him to the room where Margaret rested. She was thinner than in the photograph, her pale face contrasting with her dark hair spread over the white pillow. But when she opened her eyes and saw him standing in the doorway, her smile was exactly as Thomas had imagined all those months. Margaret tried to get up, but Thomas quickly approached, holding her hand gently. She whispered his name as if she couldn't believe he was really there, that he had left his farm and traveled so far for it. Thomas sat down in the chair next to the bed and finally spoke the words he had kept in his heart throughout the trip. In that small room in Chicago, surrounded by the affection of the Sullivan sisters, Thomas knew he had made the right decision. True love could not be replaced or exchanged. It existed between two specific people, like a bridge, built word by word, letter by letter, dream by dream. The months that followed in Chicago were the most challenging and at the same time the most significant of Thomas's life. He rented a small room in a boarding house near the Sullivan home and spent his days caring for Margaret with the dedication of a gardener tending to her most precious plant. The illness had left Margaret weak and frail, but with each passing day, the glow slowly returned to her blue eyes. Thomas brought to that stuffy Chicago room a little bit of the outdoors of Arizona. He would tell Margaret about the sunsets that painted the mountains red, about the sound of the wind passing through the rocky canyons, about the sense of freedom that only existed when you could look at the horizon without seeing the end. As he spoke, he held her hand, feeling day after day how his fingers regained strength, how his skin returned to the healthy color he had imagined through his letters. The Triplet sisters became precious allies on that healing journey. Mary prepared nutritious soups that helped Margaret regain the lost weight. Rose brought fresh flowers from the market every day, filling the room with colors and perfumes that reminded her of life blooming. Catherine read aloud to Margaret during the long afternoons, choosing stories that spoke of hope and renewal. Together, the four Sullivan sisters created around Margaret a circle of love and care that seemed to speed up her recovery. During the long nights when he stayed awake in the small room of the boarding house, Thomas thought about how his life had changed completely. 6 months ago, he was a lone farmer whose only companionship was his animals and the casual workers who passed through his property. Now she discovered that she could love with an intensity she never knew she possessed, that she could be patient when the situation called for it, that she could find purpose not only in hard work, but in the gentle care of another person. Spring has arrived in Chicago, bringing with it a remarkable transformation in Margaret. She began to be able to sit on the bed for longer periods, then to walk slowly around the room, leaning on Thomas's strong arm. His cheeks regained their rosy color, and his voice, which had been just a whisper for weeks, returned to the sweet melody that Thomas had imagined while reading his letters in Arizona. It was on a May morning, as the sun came through the window illuminating Margaret's dark hair like a golden halo, that Thomas finally asked the question he had kept in his heart all those months. He knelt by the bedside, held both of her hands between his, and asked if she still wanted to go with him to Arizona, if she still dreamed of building a family in that faraway land where the sky seemed endless. Margaret's answer came through tears of joy and a smile that lit up the entire room. She said she had spent the months of recovery dreaming not only of getting healthy again, but of finding out if the love she had borne through letters could flourish in real life. Now she knew she did. Thomas had crossed an entire continent to be by her side when she needed it most, had chosen the uncertainty of a sick woman over the safety of a healthy woman. This was the kind of man she wanted to build a life with. The wedding took place at the end of June, in a simple ceremony in the small church in the neighborhood where the Sullivans had grown up. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Mary's skilled hands to fit her still delicate body perfectly. The three Triplet sisters served as godmothers, each beaming with happiness to see Margaret recovered and about to begin the life she had dreamed of for so many years. The trip back to Arizona was completely different from the solitary journey Thomas had made months earlier. This time he had Margaret by his side, watching through the train window as the landscape gradually changed from noisy cities to green plains and finally to the golden desert that would be his new home. Margaret held his hand as she looked at her new land for the first time, her eyes shining with the same wonder Thomas felt every time he contemplated that vastness. The farm welcomed them as a warm embrace. The White House glowed in the late afternoon sun. The flowers Thomas had planted months earlier had grown and spread, creating a wild garden that seemed to welcome the new owner of the house. Margaret walked slowly through the rooms, touching the furniture Thomas had so carefully polished, admiring the curtains he had chosen with her in mind, smiling when she saw the stack of her letters still neatly tucked away on the desk. The first years of marriage were a time of constant discovery. Margaret learned to live in the slower pace of the desert, to appreciate the vast silences that had frightened Thomas during his years of solitude, to find beauty in the austerity of that endless landscape. Thomas found that sharing his life with someone didn't diminish his freedom, but multiplied it, giving new meaning to each sunset, each rare rain that blessed his lands. Margaret transformed the house into a real home. She planted a garden larger than roses, growing vegetables and herbs that grew surprisingly well on that land that many considered impossible. She learned to cook with locally available ingredients, creating dishes that combined the recipes she had brought from Chicago with the unique flavors of the Southwest. Most importantly, she filled the house with laughter, with long conversations that stretched into the night, with the soothing music of her voice humming as she worked. The greatest miracle came 3 years after the wedding. Margaret gave birth to a baby girl they named Rose, after her sister who had helped tend the garden while Margaret recovered. The child had the blue eyes of his mother and the quiet determination of his father, and from his earliest days he showed that he would be perfectly adapted to that life in the desert. 2 years later, a boy arrived who was named James after Thomas's father. Watching Margaret take care of her children was for Thomas a daily revelation of how love could multiply without splitting. She had become exactly the woman he had imagined through his letters, strong, gentle, able to find joy in simple things, to transform a house into a sanctuary of peace and happiness. The children grew up running free under the endless Arizona sky, learning from an early age to love that land that had united their parents through written words and shared dreams. On quiet nights when the children slept and the desert stretched silently around their home, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch he had built with her in mind. They talked about the days that had passed, about their plans for the future, about how their lives had intertwined so seamlessly despite all the obstacles they faced. Thomas often thought of the 3 Triplet sisters who had made that happiness possible, each of them going her own way, each finding her own love in Chicago or somewhere else where fate had taken them. The farm prospered under the couple's care. The herd grew, the house gained new rooms to accommodate the expanding family, and Margaret's garden became famous in the region for producing the best vegetables anyone had ever seen grow in that barren land. But more than material prosperity, Thomas and Margaret built something even more valuable, a life based on mutual respect, true love, and the belief that 2 people can create a perfect world even in the most unlikely place. Years later, when Thomas already had completely grey hair and Margaret had a few lines around her eyes that only made her smile more beautiful, they still wrote each other letters occasionally. Little notes they left for each other on the kitchen table, words of love and gratitude that kept alive the tradition that had united their hearts from the beginning, because some loves are born from cards, grow through distance, and bloom forever under the infinite sky where 2 hearts find their home. If this story of courage and true love has touched your heart, you can't miss our next adventures of the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to follow more exciting stories of men and women who faced the challenges of the desert in pursuit of their dreams.